Welcome. This is the story of a mother who stood up to protect her children and speak the truth when surrounded by lies. Let's listen. The morning was supposed to be easy, a small slice of calm in a year that had been anything but. Julia Moreau adjusted her tote bag on one shoulder as she waved her daughters off with a smile. The coastal town's Sunday craft market bustled with familiar sounds, seagulls overhead, children's laughter, the sweet tang of kettle corn in the air. Amelia, 17, had already veered toward the artisan jewelry stands while Sophie, freshly 15 and newly curious about everything, wandered toward the honey table. Julia let herself breathe. After months of grief, therapy, and unanswered questions, they were finally settling into a rhythm again. That illusion shattered with the buzz of her phone. Sophie's name blinked across the screen, her voice thin and cracking. "Mom, there are women here. They're yelling about Grandma and Grandpa. They won't let us leave." Julia was already moving. Her feet pounded against the cobblestone walkways, weaving through the crowd as the sounds of chatter blurred into a high-pitched rush of static. When she reached them, time froze for a second. 6 women, older, overdressed for a market, faces tight with righteous fury, had encircled her daughters like wolves in pearls. One leaned in, practically hissing into Sophie's tear-streaked face. "You heartless little brat. You and your sister are a disgrace to this town." Amelia stood protectively in front of her sister, fists clenched, cheeks flushed red with shame and fury. Julia stepped in without a word, placing herself between her daughters and the women. "You've made your point," she said evenly, her voice low and cold. "Now get away from my children." One of the women scoffed. "You're no better. A real wife would never turn her husband's family away. You've poisoned those girls. Bitter little rebels, that's what they are. And it's shameful." Julia looked her dead in the eye and smiled. Not with kindness, but with something sharper. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. Her girls close behind, silent but trembling, as they reached the parking lot. The women followed at a distance, still whispering, still watching. Julia unlocked the car, helped her daughters in, and drove away without saying a word. But inside, something had shifted, snapped. This wasn't just grief anymore. It wasn't a misunderstanding, a clash of mourning styles, or misguided family ties. It was targeted, it was harassment, and it was planned. As the salt wind whipped through her open window, Julia made a silent promise to herself. They might have started this war in the church pews, but she would finish it with the truth. 8 months earlier, Julia Moreau's life had cracked open with a single phone call. Daniel, her husband of 18 years, was dead, killed instantly in a car accident along the coastal highway just outside of Camden. At 49, he had left behind a wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a trail of lies so deep it would take weeks to unravel. But death wasn't the beginning of Julia's heartbreak, it was the punctuation mark at the end of a slow, agonizing sentence. Just 3 weeks before the accident, she had filed for divorce. After months of late nights, hushed phone calls, and a growing sense of absence in her own marriage, Julia had discovered the truth. Daniel had been living a second life. Not a fleeting affair, not a single lapse in judgment, but a years-long relationship with a woman named Rachel Green. And not only that, Rachel had given birth to twin boys. His sons. Julia didn't discover this through some grand confession. No, it was her daughters, Amelia and Sophie, who found the first clues. A forgotten iPad, an open email account, a photo buried in a cloud folder. They brought it to her, faces pale, hands shaking, asking, "Mom, is this what we think it is?" Julia's world buckled. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the knowledge that her children had carried the weight of it first. Trying to protect her. After confronting Daniel, his response was cold, transactional. He hadn't intended to tell them, ever. "There's no point in destroying everything," he had said. "The boys are young. They'll never know the difference." But then, in a cruel twist of fate, the accident took both him and Rachel in one final breath. And with that breath, the entire secret unraveled in the public eye. The twins, now orphaned, became a symbol, not just of Daniel's deception, but of everything he had tried to hide behind family photos and small-town charm. At first, Julia tried to shield her daughters from the fallout. They went to therapy. She declined interviews. She grieved quietly. But Daniel's parents, Margaret and Reverend Charles Whitcomb, refused to let it rest. They demanded to see the girls. Called it their God-given right. When Julia gently said no, explaining the trauma, the boundaries, the need for space, they escalated. Visits turned to voicemails. Pleas turned into accusations. You're keeping them from their only family. Margaret had shouted one day outside the house. They owe it to their brothers, to us. Amelia was clear. We are not their sisters. Not like this. Not right now. Sophie, quieter, simply refused to speak their names. And Julia stood by her daughters, knowing full well what that defiance would cost. She had already seen how quickly small towns turned cold. The looks at the grocery store. The whispers in the post office. The Sunday silence from neighbors who used to wave. Margaret and Charles had started to spin their own version of events, one where they were the victims. Abandoned by a heartless daughter-in-law and ungrateful granddaughters. And now, the church community they once called home was beginning to listen. Julia thought if she stayed silent, the storm might pass. She thought people would see the truth in time. But that Saturday at the market made one thing clear: silence wasn't protection. It was permission, and she had given them enough of it. That night, after the confrontation at the market, Julia sat alone in the kitchen. The house silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant crash of waves against the rocky Maine shore. Her daughters had gone to bed early, Amelia curled up with a book. Sophie silent, still shaken. Julia cradled a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Her thoughts circling like gulls over open water. On instinct, she opened her laptop and logged into Facebook. Half expecting nothing, half knowing exactly what she'd find. There it was, tucked within a private group run by St. Elias Church. A post by Margaret Whitcomb, her former mother-in-law. It was long, nearly 1,000 words, and styled like a prayer request, full of gentle phrases and spiritual platitudes. But beneath the polished veneer was venom. Margaret claimed she and her husband had been abandoned in their grief, left to mourn not only their son but the two innocent boys their daughter-in-law refuses to acknowledge. She wrote of Julia's coldness, of how she had turned her daughters against their own blood, and worst of all, claimed that the twins were the result of a surrogacy arrangement Julia had agreed to because she was infertile. The implication: the boys were hers, and she had rejected them solely because they were male. Julia read that line 3 times before she could breathe. The lie was so twisted, so calculated. It didn't even sting, it just stunned. And yet, the comments below painted the picture Margaret wanted. Praying for you. So heartbreaking. Those poor babies. A few pushed back. This doesn't sound like the Julia I know. But they were drowned out by sympathy for a woman who had turned grief into theater. Julia's fingers trembled over the keyboard. Not with rage, but with resolve. It had been building slowly. Quietly. She'd wanted to take the high road. To focus on her girls. To avoid dragging their pain through the mud. But now the mud had found them anyway. And there was only one way forward, through it. They wanted to rewrite the story? Fine. Julia had something they didn't. Receipts. Real ones, emails, texts, voicemails, bank records, therapy notes. Not speculation. Not scripture twisted into guilt. But facts. She clicked the laptop shut and stood up. Her tea untouched. Cold as her clarity. Margaret had made her play. She had gathered her army in Sunday best and disguised cruelty as compassion. But Julia had her own truth to tell, and unlike Margaret, she didn't need to hide behind whispers. She would tell it loud. And she would tell it all. Julia didn't go to work the next morning. She called in a personal day. Her voice calm but unwavering as she told the front office she had family matters to attend to. Then, while the house was still quiet and the morning fog lingered over the ocean outside her kitchen window, she brewed the strongest coffee she could manage, pulled her hair into a knot, and laid out everything she hadn't touched in months. A thumb drive, dusty and half forgotten, lay at the bottom of a drawer beneath tax documents and school forms. It held everything, proof she had quietly collected in the weeks leading up to the divorce filing. Emails between Daniel and Rachel. Some dated while Julia and the girls were on family vacations. Photos of the two of them, one taken in Julia's own living room. with Sophie's art taped to the wall in the background like a silent witness. There were bank records showing regular transfers to Rachel's account, marked vaguely as consulting fees. And then there were the voicemails. Margaret's brittle voice accusing Amelia and Sophie of killing their father by supporting their mother. Reverend Charles's voice, slurred and cruel, calling the girls godless brats who would burn in hell for turning on family. Julia had listened to that one only once before, and it had left her shaking. Now, it steeled her. She organized the files into folders on her laptop: digital evidence, financial records, emotional abuse, therapy documentation. Then, at precisely 11:15 a.m., she walked into the print shop on Main Street. The man behind the counter, young and pierced, raised an eyebrow as she handed him the flash drive. Full color, high resolution, double-sided, 10 copies, she said. Clean binding. Think church bulletin meets legal exhibit. He hesitated, scrolling through the folders. These are pretty personal. Julia looked him in the eye. So is what they did to my daughters. He nodded and got to work. While the files printed, she went to a nearby craft store and picked up what she needed: soft navy blue report covers, gold embossed name plates, and heavy paper for the title page. Back home, she cleared the dining table and began assembling the binders one by one. Hands steady, her movements methodical. Each began with a title page in elegant script: Michael Whitcomb and Rachel Green, a love story. Below the text, she pasted the photo: Daniel and Rachel kissing on Julia's couch. Sophie's artwork blurred in the corner. Then came the emails, the text messages, the therapy notes, and finally the voicemails, transcribed and footnoted. It read like a novel. Except every word was real. By midnight, the 10 binders stood in a row across the counter, identical in form and devastating in content. Julia stared at them, her heart racing not with fear, but with clarity. These weren't just files. They were a map of the betrayal, a timeline of the gaslighting, a record of the emotional warfare waged against her and her girls, all neatly bound in navy and gold. She didn't sleep much that night, but when she did, it was the first dreamless sleep she'd had in months. The next morning, dressed in simple slacks and a soft gray cardigan, she drove to St. Elias Church just before the service began. The parking lot was already full. She walked inside with a calm she didn't quite recognize in herself. No one stopped her. No one questioned her presence. She knew the layout well, too well. The hymnals were kept in wooden holders beneath every pew. Without a sound, she slid one binder beneath each aisle. 10 in total. 10 truths. When she stepped outside into the sunlight, the wind off the harbor felt different, sharper, cleaner. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and didn't look back. The moment she pulled away, the first chords of the opening hymn rang out. By the time they sang the second verse, the secrets they'd buried so carefully were already making their rounds. And Julia, she was already home, sipping fresh coffee, her daughters still asleep, while the truth she'd hand-delivered began to burn quietly through the lies. By noon, the storm had broken. Julia hadn't planned to watch it unfold, but the ripple effect of truth has a way of finding you, even when you stay still. Her phone buzzed relentlessly on the kitchen counter. Facebook notifications, missed calls, cryptic texts. She ignored them at first, choosing instead to slice apples and warm up cinnamon rolls for Sophie and Amelia, who had just woken up, groggy but smiling. For a brief, sacred window, Julia let herself pretend this was just another Sunday morning. But after Sophie left the table, Amelia lingered, her phone in hand. "Mom," she said, cautiously, the church threads blowing up. Julia met her daughter's eyes, searching for fear, and found only the cautious glint of something steadier. Confidence. Vindication. "Did you do this?" Amelia asked, the corner of her mouth twitching into the beginning of a smile. Julia didn't answer with words. She didn't have to. Amelia just nodded. Good. Across town, St. Elias Church was unraveling. The 10 binders had circulated faster than gossip ever could. Someone had snapped photos, screenshots of Rachel and Daniel, snippets of text messages, the voicemail transcriptions, and uploaded them to the church's Facebook group before the admin had time to delete the post. By then, it was too late. The whispers had become gasps. The doubt had become fury. Julia's friend, Mark Rivera, called around 2 that afternoon, speaking in a hushed voice like he was reporting from behind enemy lines. "It's chaos here," he muttered. Pastor Miller had to shut down the group. There were actual fights in the comment section. Julia sat down, phone pressed to her ear. "Fights?" she repeated. Mark sighed. "Turns out a few people knew. Or at least suspected. The older couples, the ones who always host prayer circles, they tried to keep it quiet to protect the family." Julia felt her stomach twist. Not in surprise, but in bitter confirmation. The silence hadn't been ignorance, it had been complicity. People had seen Daniel's second life forming like a shadow, and they had chosen to look away. But now, confronted with the evidence, some of them were starting to speak up, and others were starting to back away from Margaret and Reverend Charles. A group of women, Mark explained, had approached Margaret after service, confronting her in the foyer. One of the church deacons called an emergency meeting with the elders. "They're calling it slander," Mark said, "but no one's defending her like they used to. Not anymore." Julia didn't smile. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about stopping something that should have ended long ago. About showing Margaret that her version of the story no longer held power. That her lies couldn't pass as prayers anymore. And most of all, it was about Amelia and Sophie. Julia glanced toward the hallway, where her daughters had retreated with books and music, finally laughing again without looking over their shoulders. Later that evening, Julia received 2 things in the mail. One was a letter from an elderly woman at the church. One Julia barely knew. Inside was a handwritten apology addressed to both of her daughters, acknowledging their pain and condemning the way they'd been treated. The other was more formal, an invitation from the church's Women's Council, asking Julia to attend a reconciliation luncheon the following Sunday. She held it in her hand for a long moment before sliding it into a drawer without a word. Some invitations don't deserve an RSVP. Some wounds don't want a meal. What Julia had offered wasn't a truce, it was the truth. And if the church was burning, it was because they had spent too long pretending the smoke wasn't real. Arrived on a Thursday morning. Hand-delivered by a man in a windbreaker who barely met Julia's eyes. "Are you Julia Moreau?" he asked. Too polite to sound sincere. She nodded. He handed her the envelope, nodded again, and walked back to his car without waiting for a signature. Julia closed the door, heart already sinking with a weight she hadn't felt in weeks. She knew before she opened it. Inside was a neatly stapled motion filed with the Portsmouth County Family Court. Petition for emergency custody, Charles and Margaret Whitcomb versus Julia Moreau. Her breath caught. They had done it. They'd crossed the final line. The same people who had called her daughters heartless in public, who weaponized their grief in whispers and church bulletins, were now trying to take them away. Their argument? That Julia was emotionally unstable. That she was poisoning Amelia and Sophie against their only remaining blood relatives. That she was isolating them in a home filled with bitterness and anti-Christian influence. It read like fiction, offensive, delusional fiction, but it was real. She stared at the words, hands trembling, not from fear but fury. This wasn't just a vendetta anymore. It was an invasion. She called Dana Caldwell, her attorney. Immediately, Dana listened calmly, flipping through a digital copy of the documents. "They're pushing hard," she said. "Emergency custody filings usually mean they're trying to get ahead of something, force a quick ruling before you can prepare." Julia's voice was flat but certain. "They're going to be disappointed." Dana chuckled dryly. "That's what I like about you. You never panic. But we'll still need everything, every voicemail, text, screenshot, anything that shows the harassment and how the girls are doing under your care." Julia already had it. She opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out the binder of truth, the one she'd kept for herself. "It's all here," she said. "They don't get to rewrite our lives just because they miss the feeling of control." That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Julia sat at the kitchen table and began building a new folder, this one for court. Voicemails where Margaret blamed Sophie for Daniel's death. Text messages filled with contempt. Screenshots from the now-defunct church Facebook group, capturing the slander in its original form. She even included therapy reports, notes showing how Amelia had started writing again. How Sophie had finally slept through the night without waking from nightmares. This wasn't a house of chaos. It was a house of healing. But now, that healing was under threat. Margaret and Charles were trying to rip the ground out from under them just as they'd begun to feel safe again. Julia leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She wasn't afraid of court. Not anymore. Let them come. Let them speak their twisted truths and hide behind doctrine and deception. She had facts. She had witnesses. She had her daughters. And now, she had a cause worth going to war for. Just when Julia thought she had accounted for every move Margaret and Charles might make. The next blow came, not from the courthouse, but from an old friend. The email arrived late Sunday night from Megan Thompson, Amelia's former best friend's mother. They hadn't spoken since the divorce announcement nearly a year earlier, and Julia almost didn't open it. But the subject line, "You need to know this," compelled her hand. Inside was a message equal parts warning and apology. "I've been speaking with Margaret," Megan wrote. "She's been reaching out to other moms, PTA, neighbors, even the youth group coordinator. She's building a case, saying you're unstable, emotionally abusive, that you've turned the girls into bitter, angry atheists." I didn't believe her, but others, they might. Julia read the message 3 times before pushing away from the table. Her pulse steady but her hands cold. They were trying to poison the well. Not with evidence, with whispers, and they were targeting the very people who had once sat at her kitchen table. Who had hugged her daughters, passed them napkins, asked about homework and homecoming dresses. Julia picked up the phone and called Megan, her voice low and even. Did she say who she contacted? Megan hesitated. Not everyone, but she mentioned Miss Carter from the PTA and maybe Susan, the one next door. Julia swallowed hard. Susan had always been cold, but now her judgmental glances from across the yard took on a new weight. "I just thought you should know," Megan said. "I told her I wasn't interested in being involved, but she's trying to gain traction." Julia closed her eyes and exhaled. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, and for not buying into it." Megan's voice softened. "You're a good mom, Julia. Always were. Amelia used to say it all the time." After they hung up, Julia sat in silence, watching Amelia and Sophie doing homework at the dining table, their heads bent, calm and unguarded for once. They were finally safe enough to breathe, and now someone was trying to suffocate that peace with lies. She wouldn't tell them, not yet. They didn't need more fear. They needed a mother who was steady in the face of chaos. Julia reached for her notepad and began a new list: witnesses, counters, evidence. Let them talk. Let them spin their stories. She was ready to speak louder, with truth, with proof, and with purpose. The courthouse smelled like stale coffee and damp paper, an odd comfort to Julia as she walked through the double doors. Amelia and Sophie flanking her like shadows of strength. They wore their best, Amelia in a navy blazer, Sophie in a soft gray dress. Both girls too composed for their age. But Julia knew the truth, this was armor. Sophie's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her sister's hand. Amelia gave a reassuring squeeze. "I want to look her in the eye," Sophie had said the night before. "I want her to see we're not scared anymore." Julia hadn't expected that kind of bravery from a 15-year-old. But then again, these girls had been forged in fire. Across the courtroom sat Margaret and Reverend Charles Whitcomb, poised in pew-perfect posture, their lawyer smoothing out papers like it was just another day at church. Margaret wore a powder blue blouse and a string of pearls, her expression one of fragile grief, but Julia saw through it. She had worn that same expression at Daniel's funeral, right before blaming Sophie for his death. When the proceedings began, the Whitcomb's attorney wasted no time painting Julia as a bitter, emotionally unstable woman who had intentionally alienated the girls from their only remaining blood relatives. She cited the Facebook post, yes, that post, as a plea from a grieving grandmother, desperate to remain in her granddaughters' lives. There was no mention, of course, of the part where Margaret had called Sophie a disgrace. No mention of the public confrontation at the market. No mention of the binders. Julia kept her expression neutral, but her heart pounded in quiet rage. Then it was their turn. Dana Caldwell, poised and surgical, began without fanfare. She didn't argue, she presented First came the voicemails. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Margaret's voice echoed through the speakers. You little monsters. I hope you cry yourselves to sleep every night until you realize what you did to him. Gasps rippled from the gallery. Then came the texts. One from Charles. Ungrateful brats. They'll burn for turning their backs on blood. And then the images. A photo of Daniel and Rachel kissing in Julia's living room. Sophie's childhood drawings taped to the wall behind them. And then, like a final dagger, the now infamous binder of truth, a curated timeline of deceit, abuse, and manipulation. The judge flipped through it slowly, stopping at the photo before lifting her eyes to Margaret. I've read this cover to cover, the judge said, voice calm but edged in steel. Do you deny any of this? Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And then something unexpected happened. From the back of the courtroom, a voice rose. Your Honor, I'd like to speak, if I may. It was Mark Rivera, standing tall in a pressed shirt, his voice unwavering, sworn in as a character witness. He spoke simply. He had known the Moreau family for years, had watched Julia raise her daughters with patience and love. He had seen how Margaret twisted the church community into a weapon. How the truth had been buried beneath performance and pity. She weaponized her grief, he said, gesturing to Margaret, and in doing so, she tried to destroy these girls. Margaret gasped, but no one rushed to her defense this time. The judge leaned back, then nodded once, firmly. The petition for emergency custody is denied, she declared. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient cause to issue a no-contact order, effective immediately, for a minimum of 1 year, barring the petitioners from any direct or indirect communication with the minors. Margaret's mouth opened in disbelief. Charles lowered his head. Dana placed a gentle hand on Julia's shoulder. Then the judge turned to her. Ms. Moreau, she said, I want to commend you. Rarely does a parent come this prepared, this composed, in the face of such hostility. Your daughters are lucky to have you. Julia could barely nod, her throat tight. Amelia squeezed her hand under the table. Sophie blinked rapidly, her lip trembling, but neither of them cried. Not until they got home. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Julia hadn't told anyone, but the story had leaked. One stepped forward. Ms. Moreau, do you have a comment on today's ruling? Julia paused, her daughters beside her, their hands still linked with hers. Yes, she said simply. Let this be a reminder, grief does not excuse cruelty. And protecting your children? That doesn't make you vindictive. It makes you a parent. The silence came slowly, first like a distant storm that didn't arrive, and then like a hush that lingered. No more voicemails, no more church women lurking behind flower displays at the grocery store. No more concerned messages, disguised as invitations to talk. The court order had done what boundaries and reason never could. It shut Margaret and Charles Whitcomb down. They disappeared from the girls' lives not with apologies or closure, but with retreat. And Julia knew better than to mistake that silence for surrender. It was strategy. They would regroup, reframe, replot. But this time, she wasn't afraid. The girls weren't either. Sophie returned to therapy with new resolve. I want to talk about why I froze, she told her counselor, referring to the market confrontation. I want to understand how to make sure I don't again. Amelia began writing again, filling pages with poetry and reflections, most of which Julia never read. But once, while changing Sophie's sheets, she glimpsed an open page that read, She called me broken, but I'm still standing. Julia, for her part, finally began to sleep through the night. No more phone hidden under her pillow. No more breath held at every knock on the door. Instead, she made dinner without dread, folded laundry while humming, and noticed the strange new rhythm of peace settling over their home. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten in delicate cursive, on stiff cream stationery, from Margaret. Not an apology, not really, a performance. Again, she spoke of losing everything, her grief being misunderstood, and referred to the custody battle as a moment of desperation. In the final paragraph, she wrote, I pray that one day you'll allow us back into the girls' lives. Family is all we have. Julia folded the letter neatly, slipped it into a folder marked documentation, and said nothing. Around the same time, Mark Rivera called with another update. The pastor at St. Elias had stepped down, and 3 families had withdrawn their children from the youth group in protest. They're tired, he said, of calling it faith when it's just control. Julia understood. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. Some were meant to burn, so others could finally see the light. In the ashes of everything the Whitcombs had tried to destroy, Julia and her daughters had built something better. Not just peace, safety, truth, a home that no longer whispered, but finally breathed. 1 year to the day after the court's ruling, Julia stood on a modest stage in a sunlit community center, palms damp but steady as she looked out at a room full of strangers, single parents, grandparents raising grandchildren, young mothers clutching toddlers to their hips. She had been invited to speak at a forum on navigating custody battles and toxic in-laws. And though public speaking had never been her strength, something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw herself as a victim, not even just a survivor. She saw herself as a mother who had made a choice to stop apologizing for protecting her children. I used to think silence was maturity, she told the room, voice clear, unwavering, that if I just kept the peace, my daughters would be okay. But I've learned that silence isn't peace. Sometimes, it's permission, and I won't give that to anyone, ever again. The room was still for a long moment before the applause broke. Quiet at first, then rising. Afterward, 3 women came up to her in tears. One whispering, "I thought I was alone." Julia touched her arm gently and said, "You're not. You just haven't spoken loud enough for your people to find you." That night, she returned home to a kitchen that smelled like chocolate brownies and a living room echoing with laughter. Sophie was humming to herself, apron dusted with flour. Amelia was dancing in socks, clutching a wooden spoon like a microphone. Julia leaned against the doorway, watching them, something warm and weightless blooming in her chest. It wasn't perfect, there were still scars. And there always would be. But scars were proof that healing had begun. At the table, as they sat down for dessert, Amelia raised her glass of milk and said with a mischievous grin, "To survival." Julia shook her head gently, smiling. "No," she said, "to something better." Sophie lifted her glass too, eyes shining. "To truth." Their glasses clinked, and they laughed. For the first time in a very long time, Julia felt light, not because the storm had passed, but because she had walked straight through it, and come out not just whole, but stronger. This was their new beginning. And this time, they had written the story themselves. The story of Julia Moreau teaches that silence in the face of injustice isn't peace, it's surrender. True strength lies in protecting what matters, even when the world demands you stay quiet. By choosing truth over appearances and action over fear, Julia shows that standing up for your children isn't vindictive, it's love in its fiercest form. The lesson is clear. You don't owe anyone your silence when that silence enables cruelty. In reclaiming her voice, Julia gave her daughters more than safety, she gave them the power to believe that even in the darkest moments, truth is worth fighting for.